Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The first two silos had been easy money, 30 days each, standard DOE decommission work, cut the auxiliary feeds, seal the ventilation shafts, survey the concrete, certify the structure for permanent closure, pour the plug. I'd done the same job on old mining shafts in Wyoming, condemned wells outside Bakersfield, and a flooded reservoir station near Butte that nobody else would bid on because the margins were garbage and the travel time was worse. That was the work Metzger Environmental Services survived on. 3 employees, 2 trucks, 1 man with a confined space certification willing to go down holes the government wanted to forget. My brother Aaron ran an electrical supply shop in Bozeman and had never trusted a federal contract in his life. He kept telling me to sell the trucks before the trucks sold me. I told him one more season. I'd been telling him one more season for 6 years. Site 3 was supposed to be another dead missile hole in the Montana Badlands. Another closure certificate, another invoice, another month of keeping my name on the side of the truck. Phil Cotter was on the radio when I turned off the county road and onto the access track. He was already parked in his government sedan near the perimeter gate, which was the extent of Phil's involvement in any physical sense. Phil was my DOE liaison, a mid-grade federal employee from the Richland Operations Office in Washington State, assigned to babysit the contractor and sign the completion certificate. We'd worked the first 2 silos together over the past 2 months. He brought the paperwork. I brought the tools. Between inspections, he sat in his car and filled out crossword puzzles from a book he kept in his glove box. He'd started saving the hard ones for me because his wife had lost patience with him calling home about 7-letter words for maritime law. "Coming up on the gate now," I said. "You unlock it already?" "Padlock's off. Fair warning, the road past the fence is worse than the other sites. The access lane washed out near the east berm." The chain-link perimeter at the first 2 silos had been old, sagging, sun-bleached, with DOE placards so faded you could barely make out the classification text. Typical for sites decommissioned and abandoned for 40-odd years. Standard government neglect. This fence had new posts set in fresh concrete. The razor wire was bright and unweathered. Motion sensors mounted every 50 yards had clean housings with steady green indicator lights, recently serviced on a facility that was supposedly dead. I pulled through the gate and parked beside Phil's sedan. He got out holding a manila folder thick enough to need a rubber band around it. "This the completion packet?" I asked. "Pre-entry authorization, plus the structural survey from 67 and the decommission order from 91. He handed it through my window. Half of it's redacted worse than the other 2 combined. "Why?" "Because Site 3 got pulled from a records reconciliation list instead of the standard closure inventory." That is the answer I got. I do not know what it means, and the person who told me sounded like she didn't either. I looked at the fence again. Records reconciliation doesn't pour concrete around fence posts. Agreed. Phil rubbed the bridge of his nose. He was a thin man in his 50s who wore short-sleeve dress shirts 12 months of the year and had a perpetual sunburn across the tops of his ears. I called Richland about the blacked-out sections. They told me the redactions were appropriate for the site classification. What classification? That part was also redacted. I flipped through the packet. The structural survey was mostly intact. Depth measurements, concrete grade assessments, shaft diameter, equipment removal verification. The decommission order had entire paragraphs blacked out with ink, so heavy it warped the paper. One surviving line referenced legacy infrastructure requiring ongoing environmental monitoring, which could mean anything from groundwater contamination to asbestos. The surface structures told a confused story. The silo cap housing, the big concrete lid that sealed the shaft from above, was cracked and moss-stained, steel reinforcement bars visible through spalled concrete. The auxiliary buildings had caved roofs and broken windows. Weeds grew through the asphalt. Every visible sign said the site had been rotting since the early 90s. But the perimeter fence was maybe 2 years old, and the utility conduit running from the nearest county road to the silo's junction box had clean PVC piping with date stamps I could read from 20 feet away. Old site, new security, new power feed. None of it had been in the bid package. I suited up at the truck. Hard hat, harness, rappelling gear, gas monitor, radio, headlamp, pry bar, and the small battery-powered inspection camera I used for tight shafts. Phil watched from beside his car with his arms crossed and his crossword book tucked under one arm. "Standard timeline?" he asked. "Down and back in 3 hours. Maybe 4 if the lower levels have standing water. I'll radio when I reach the bottom and again when I start the ascent." "Copy that. I'll be here." The shaft entrance was through the silo cap housing. I unbolted the access hatch, a 2-foot square steel plate set into the concrete floor, and shone my headlamp down into the darkness below. The ladder rungs were corroded but intact. My gas monitor showed breathable air, low carbon dioxide, and clean methane readings, standard for a dry, sealed underground space. I clipped into my harness, set my descender on the safety cable, and started down. The first 80 feet looked right. Bare concrete walls, condensation beading on the surface, old cable trays stripped of wiring, junction boxes with cut leads hanging loose. Decommission teams had come through in the early 90s and pulled everything worth salvaging. What remained was structural. The bones of a Minuteman launch facility built during the Kennedy administration and emptied when the Cold War ended. I'd gone down 2 of these already. I knew the architecture. Below the access shaft, the silo opened into the main launch chamber, where the missile rack had stood. Below that were equipment bays, fuel storage, and the environmental control level. My job was to inspect every level, confirm structural soundness, then come back up and prepare the shaft for the concrete plug. At 120 feet, I reached the transition collar where the access shaft widened into the main chamber, and I stopped on the ladder. The blueprint in Phil's packet showed an empty cylindrical room, 140 feet tall, 40 feet in diameter, with the missile rack removed and the launch rail dismantled. That was what the first 2 silos had looked like. Big hollow drums of reinforced concrete, stripped bare, stained with old hydraulic fluid and bird droppings from whatever had gotten in through the ventilation shafts. This chamber was full. The missile rack was gone. In its place, arranged in concentric rings around the central floor, stood rows of vertical cylinders. Each was roughly 8 feet tall, translucent, mounted on steel base plates bolted directly into the concrete. Dozens of them. My headlamp struck the nearest cylinder and passed through its surface far enough to show what was inside. A body. Pale, long-limbed, folded into a position that made my hands clamp down on the ladder rung. The knees bent backward from any human configuration, and the arms wrapped behind the torso at angles that would have required dislocated shoulders. The head tilted to one side at a degree that would have meant a broken neck on a person. The skin was smooth white with a faint grey undertone, hairless, and the proportions were wrong in every direction. The limbs were too long. The torso was too narrow. The fingers, 7 on the hand visible through the glass, curled against the spine. Each cylinder had a control panel at its base. Small indicator lights held steady green. Active monitoring, active power. I keyed my radio. "Phil!" Static for 2 seconds, then, "Go ahead." The main chamber isn't empty. The missile rack has been replaced with some kind of container array. Vertical tanks, dozens of them, all powered, all running. Running on what? The site's supposed to be off-grid. The power feed I flagged outside, the new conduit, it's feeding something down here. What kind of containers? Chemical storage? I looked through the translucent wall of the nearest cylinder again. The body inside had its eyes shut. A thin membrane of condensation separated its face from the glass, and behind that membrane, the chest moved. A shallow, slow expansion. Once, every 8 or 10 seconds. Phil, I need you to make some calls. Dale, what's in them? They're occupied. There are things inside them, and they are alive. Get on the phone to Richland and find out what this site actually is, because it is not an empty silo. Phil didn't answer for a long time. I could hear his breathing on the channel and the faint sound of wind across his sedan's microphone. Come back up, he said. Right now. Come up and we'll figure it out from the surface. I started climbing. As I ascended past the transition collar and back into the narrow access shaft, I glanced down one more time. Rows of green lights burned in the darkness, dozens of them, steady and alive. 80 feet from the surface, the lights went out. Every silo has auxiliary power feeds, secondary lines that run heating, ventilation, drainage pumps, and monitoring equipment independent of the main electrical grid. Standard capping protocol requires cutting those feeds before you pour the concrete plug. Energized wiring does not belong inside 400 tons of wet cement. I'd cut the auxiliary feed on this silo as part of my surface prep, 40 minutes before I went down the shaft. Normal procedure. I'd done the same thing at the first two sites without consequence, because at the first two sites, nothing was drawing power from those lines. Here, something was. The delay between my cutting the feed and the failure below told me the cylinders had been running on stored charge, a buffer battery or capacitor bank that had just depleted. The system had bled down in stages, exactly the way an old containment array would if someone had labelled the live support circuit as environmental monitoring and filed it under abandoned infrastructure. The main chamber went dark for perhaps 3 seconds. Then emergency lighting activated. Red spectrum floods mounted in recessed housings along the shaft walls, and the silo turned the colour of an injury. The red light was harsh and directional, throwing the concrete surfaces into sharp relief. And in that new illumination I saw the shaft walls clearly for the first time. Murals. Hand-painted, large-scale military-style murals running the full circumference of the upper shaft. The kind of optimistic propaganda art you found in Air Force installations from the 1950s and 60s. Blue skies, contrails, officers in dress uniforms, the American eagle, phrases in block lettering about vigilance and readiness. Someone had painted over them decades ago with heavy grey primer and stenciled warning symbols, radiation trefoils, biohazard markers, DOE containment classifications in block text. But the primer was old, and the murals underneath were bleeding through. Where the grey had cracked or peeled, the original images showed in bright government colours. One section near the 80-foot mark stopped me on the ladder. The grey paint had peeled away almost entirely, exposing a mural panel roughly 6 feet wide. It showed 3 Air Force officers in 1950s dress blues, standing in a formal receiving line, hands extended. Shaking hands with 3 figures that were taller, paler, and built with the same wrong proportions as the things in the cylinders below. The handshake was painted with the same stiff, patriotic optimism as every other Cold War mural I'd ever seen in a government building. A ceremony, a partnership, something to be proud of. The officers were smiling. The tall figures stood upright with composed, diplomatic stillness. Behind both groups were an American flag and another symbol I didn't recognize. Whatever was stored in this silo, the Air Force had once welcomed it. Phil, the power just failed down here. I cut the auxiliary feed during surface prep, and I think the equipment in the main chamber was running off that line. The hatch is locked. What? The access hatch. The one you went down through. It just sealed itself. I heard the bolts engage. I'm standing on top of it right now and I can't get it open. Electromagnetic locks. The hatch was a containment door designed to seal the shaft from above in the event of system failure. Its designed failure state was sealed. The silo was built to keep its contents inside. I climbed faster. At 30 feet below the hatch I could see it. The steel plate I'd unbolted an hour ago, now flush against its frame with the magnetic locks engaged. There was no manual release visible from below. Phil, listen to me. There has to be an override on the surface housing. A manual release, a junction box, something. These containment systems always have a physical bypass. I'm looking. Dale, I need to tell you something. I made calls while you were down there. I reached a duty officer at the Richland emergency line. When I described what you told me about the containers, he put me on hold for 6 minutes. The man who came on after that was not from Richland. He asked for the site coordinates, the number of containers you'd reported, and whether any of them were open. Then he told me a response team was being dispatched, and I should vacate the site before they arrive. Estimated arrival, 90 minutes. A response team. What kind? He wouldn't specify. He used the phrase emergency containment protocol and told me the site perimeter would be secured on arrival. Phil's voice tightened. Dale? He sounded like a man describing a fire already out of control. Something cracked below me, a deep, wet, pressurized sound, like a seal breaking on a vessel that had been shut for decades. Then another. Then a low, gurgling, fluid draining through channels, running down surfaces, pooling on concrete. The green indicator lights I'd seen on the cylinders were gone. Through the red emergency floods, I could see amber lights cycling across the base panels. The stored charge was gone. The main power feed was severed. The cylinders had entered failure. The seals that had kept pressure, temperature, and whatever else stable for decades were losing authority one after another. Down there, containment was going limp. Phil, the containers are cycling. Something's happening down here. I need you to get that hatch open. I'm trying. There's a junction box on the north side of the housing, but it's padlocked with a federal seal. I'd need bolt cutters. There are bolt cutters in the bed of my truck. Red toolbox, right side. I heard Phil's footsteps on the radio, then the wind, then the truck door. More cracking rose from below. Fluid hit the chamber floor in a thin, continuous rain. Beneath that came a softer sound. Materials expanding, joints unbending, sealed things beginning to stretch. Phil came back on the radio, breathing hard. The junction box has 6 breakers and none of them are labeled. I don't know which one controls the hatch. Throw all of them. Half of them might control the systems keeping those things asleep, Dale. He was right. I was hanging 150 feet underground in a sealed shaft with an electromagnetic lock above me and rows of opening cylinders below. The one man who could help was standing in the Montana wind, trying to decide which switch to pull without making things worse. The amber lights cycled. The fluid sounds changed, thicker, slower, more intermittent, as if the drainage was finishing and what came next was something else. Phil, those things are waking up whether you pull the breakers or not. The failsafe already triggered. Get the hatch open. A pause. Then breakers being thrown, heavy switches one after another, 6 quick impacts. The hatch above me didn't move. The amber lights below didn't change. Whatever Phil had disconnected, it wasn't the locks, and it wasn't the cylinders. Nothing happened, he said. Then it's a separate circuit. The containment locks are on their own system, independent of the junction box. Dale, I don't know what else to try. I don't have schematics for this. The blueprints they gave us don't show any of this equipment. I looked down. The emergency floods lit the main chamber in deep red, and through that red I could see the cylinder's translucent walls. Behind those walls, the shapes inside were changing. Folded limbs straightened an inch at a time, the way a cramp releases. Reversed knees bent forward. Wrapped arms pulled away from torsos, tilted heads leveled. The bodies were unfolding. I couldn't go up. The hatch was sealed, and Phil didn't have the tools or the knowledge to open it. I could stay on the ladder and wait for the 90-minute response team that Phil's voice told me wasn't coming to save anyone. Or I could go down, past the opening cylinders to the lower levels where the original builders might have put a second exit, a maintenance shaft, a service tunnel, an emergency egress. The decommissioned blueprints didn't show because the blueprints had been sanitized of everything that mattered. I went down. The main chamber was warmer than it had been 20 minutes ago. Fluid covered the floor, a thin layer maybe an inch deep, warm against my boots, slick with chemicals that coated the soles and made the concrete treacherous. Half the cylinder seals had cracked open along vertical seams. Through the gaps, I saw bodies in mid-transition, limbs partially straightened, torsos expanded as lungs inflated for the first time in decades, fingers uncurling against the interior glass. One cylinder near the center of the room had a wider gap in its seal, and the arm protruding through it was moving. The hand opened and closed in a slow, autonomous rhythm, the 7 fingers flexing and curling as if testing the joints, relearning their own range. The skin on that hand was pale grey-white, the fingers too long, the knuckles spaced too far apart, the nails thick and squared off like horn. I crossed the chamber fast, keeping to the far wall, moving through the fluid as quickly as the footing allowed. The stairwell to the lower levels was on the south side, a narrow concrete spiral, descending past equipment bays toward what the blueprint labeled environmental control. Whatever it actually contained, it was below the cylinders and below the draining fluid. That was where I needed to be. The stairwell took me 40 feet down into a corridor that branched left and right. The emergency lighting was weaker here, red floods spaced farther apart, leaving stretches of near darkness between them. I went left, following the corridor toward what the blueprint showed as the primary equipment bay. The door was reinforced steel with a DOE classification placard and a dead electronic keypad. I used the pry bar. The frame gave after 3 hits. Inside, the room was full of smaller tanks, same translucent material as the cylinders above, but maybe a third the size. 4 feet tall at most, set in rows on steel shelving units like laboratory specimens. Each tank had the same base panel configuration, the same monitoring lights, the same status indicators. The lights cycled amber, same as upstairs. Inside each tank was a smaller body, curled, undeveloped, proportioned differently from the adults above, with larger heads relative to their frames, shorter limbs, joints less pronounced. Juveniles, or infants. Different stages of development showed across the rows. The nearest tanks held forms roughly the size of a human toddler. The far tanks held shapes barely larger than a fist. DOE inventory tags hung from wire loops on every tank. Serial numbers, batch codes, date stamps. The earliest date I could make out was 1974. The most recent was 3 years ago. Several tanks on the nearest shelf were empty, their monitoring panels dark, their status logs showing deactivation entries with dates and what looked like transfer codes. Inventory moved somewhere else. The adults upstairs might have been prisoners. These were something else. Offspring, clones, specimens, biological material in custody. I didn't have the words for it, and the words mattered less than the fact that the United States Department of Energy had recent inventory tags hanging on non-human bodies in a missile silo it had just hired me to seal with concrete. I backed out of the room and went right down the corridor, past storage closets and a dead water treatment station, to the last door on the level. DOE classification stamps and a chemical hazard warning marked the door. It was heavy but unlocked. I pushed it open, and the red emergency light inside showed me what lay beyond. An incineration chamber. The walls were lined with reinforced ceramic panels, the kind rated for extreme temperatures, discolored by repeated thermal cycling. The ceiling was low and vaulted, with exhaust ports feeding into ductwork too large for any standard ventilation purpose. At the center of the room, a steel grate covered a shallow pit where accelerant channels converged from 4 directions. Ash outlines covered the walls, human-shaped, dozens of them layered on top of one another in places, some crouched, some pressed flat, some with arms raised towards the door I stood in. The postures of men trying to get out, or men trying to get as far from the heat source as they could before it reached them anyway. A wire basket sat near the entrance. Inside it were personal effects, contractor ID badges from companies I didn't recognize, different firms, different logos, different decades. Hard hats with names written in marker on the suspension bands. A set of car keys on a ring with a Chevy logo that hadn't been current since the 1980s. A pocket Bible with a cracked spine. A plain gold wedding ring scratched from years of manual work. Men had been sent down here before me. Different contractors, different decades, different faces on the ID badges. They'd found what I found. They'd been trapped the way I was trapped. And when the response team arrived, the response had been fire. I keyed the radio. "Phil, are you still on site?" His voice came back broken by static, the signal degraded by the additional depth and the concrete between us. "Still here, Dale, the vehicles I can see on the access road. They're not the response team yet. Advanced cars, black SUVs, government plates. They're parked about a mile out on the county road, and they're just sitting there." "Phil, I found an incineration room on the lowest level. Burn marks on the walls in the shape of people. Contractor badges in a bin near the door, going back decades. They've been sending men down here and cooking them alive when things go wrong." Static. Then, "What do you mean, cooking them?" "The response team isn't coming to pull me out. When you talked to that man on the phone and he said emergency containment protocol, he meant they're going to destroy this silo with everything inside it. If I'm still inside, I become another outline on the wall. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The radio hissed. When Phil spoke again, his voice had the compressed, too careful quality of a man choosing each word while his hands shook. "Dale, I spoke to a second contact 20 minutes ago. Someone at the regional office. He used the words site sterilization and told me that remaining within the site perimeter after the response team's arrival would constitute a federal offense. He said it exactly like that, like he was reading liability language off a card. A breath. He told me to leave. He said anyone present at the time of sterilization would be considered part of the site contents. Part of the site contents. The language of inventory management applied to a living person. "Phil, I can't go up. The hatch is sealed and I don't have the tools to breach it from below. If there's another way out of this silo, it's down here on the lower levels. I'm going to keep looking." The SUVs on the county road just started moving toward the gate. I can see dust on the access track. "How long do I have?" "If those are advance vehicles and the main team is still behind them, maybe 45 minutes. Maybe less. I don't know how fast they set up the charges." "Then get out of here, Phil. Get in your car and drive. You were never at this site." "I signed the entry log. My name's on the authorization packet. They'll know I was here." "Then tell them I went down and never came back. And you left when I stopped answering the radio. You didn't see anything. You don't know what's in the silo. You're a paper pusher who followed protocol." The radio was silent for 10 seconds. From above, through concrete and stairwells and the fluid-slicked floor of the cylinder chamber, I heard new sounds. Breathing, deep and arrhythmic, wet at the edges, coming from more than one source. The things in the cylinders were filling their lungs. The thaw had reached autonomic function, and the air in the silo carried the sound of organisms returning to consciousness after decades of stillness. "I'm leaving," Phil said. "Dale, I'm sorry. I'm going to drive south and find a payphone and call someone. I don't know who. Someone who isn't DOE. Go." The radio clicked off. I heard the faint ghost of an engine turning over. Then the signal dissolved into static. Then there was nothing on the channel at all. I stood in the red-lit corridor of the silo's lowest level with the nursery behind me, the incineration chamber at my back, and the sounds of waking bodies filtering down from above. 45 minutes, maybe less, before the DOE turned this hole into a furnace. The main shaft was sealed. The hatch was locked. Somewhere on this level, in the walls, in the architecture, in the parts of this facility that the blueprints had been scrubbed to hide, there had to be another way out. The men who built this place, the officers who shook hands with these things and posed for murals and brokered whatever arrangement put them in those cylinders, would have given themselves a back door. They always did. The question was whether I could find it before the people who inherited their secrets decided to burn the evidence. The breathing above me grew louder. Something heavy shifted on the floor of the main chamber, the sound of a body rolling off a surface and landing on wet concrete. Then footsteps, wrong-cadenced, arrhythmic, spaced at intervals that matched a stride longer than any human leg could produce. moving across the chamber floor, toward the stairwell, toward me. I killed my headlamp and started searching the walls in the dark. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairwell and stopped. I pressed myself against the corridor wall, 20 feet from where the stairwell opened into the junction, and held my breath. The red emergency floods were spaced far apart on this level, and where I stood the light barely reached. My headlamp was off. The pry bar was in my right hand. The entity stood at the base of the stairwell for what might have been 30 seconds. I couldn't see it clearly. The angle, the distance, and the weak red light reduced it to a tall, narrow shape occupying the junction where the corridor branched. It moved its head in a slow sweep, and I heard a sound from it that was close to breathing, but carried a clicking undertone, like cartilage shifting inside a throat built on different architecture. Then it turned left, toward the nursery. I waited until the asymmetric footsteps faded down the corridor before I moved again. My hands went back to the wall. I'd been working my way along the right side corridor toward the incineration chamber, running my palms across the concrete surface the way I'd check a mine wall for voids, feeling for temperature change, structural inconsistency, hollow spots behind the face. 30 years of confined space work teaches your hands things your eyes miss. Good concrete has a uniform density you can feel through your fingertips. Patch jobs, infill panels, and false walls have seams, thermal gaps, and a different resonance when you press against them. 15 feet past the incineration chamber door, I found it. The wall surface changed from poured concrete to something mounted, a panel set in a frame, with a vertical seam on the left side and a hairline gap at the top where it met the ceiling. The surface was painted to match the surrounding concrete. In normal light, the color difference would have been invisible. In the dark, with my hands doing the seeing, the material gave itself away. Thinner, lighter, composite board rather than structural concrete, with a faint flex when I pushed. I braced my shoulder against the panel and shoved. It cracked along the left seam and swung inward 6 inches, releasing a rush of dry, cold air from the space behind it. I got my fingers into the gap and pulled. The panel broke free of its frame and fell inward. I stepped through into a room the blueprints had never shown. The red emergency lighting didn't reach here. I risked the headlamp. The beam cut across a chamber roughly 20 feet square, carved from the bedrock beneath the silo's poured concrete infrastructure. Older construction. The walls were raw stone with drill bore marks, the ceiling supported by steel I-beams that predated the Minuteman program by at least a decade. Someone had dug this room before the silo was built on top of it. A conference table filled the center of the space, heavy oak bolted to the stone floor. 8 chairs surrounded it. 4 were standard government issue, steel framed with green vinyl cushions. The other 4 were larger, with wider seats, higher backs, and a forward cant of roughly 15 degrees, as though built for occupants whose spines curved differently. Recording equipment lined one wall, reel-to-reel tape decks with Air Force asset tags, a large microphone on a desk stand, and a row of headphone jacks suggesting a translation or monitoring setup. Everything was coated in decades of dust. The tape reels had gone brittle. The power cables were cracked and grey. Photographs covered the wall behind the recording equipment, mounted in government-issue frames under glass that had fogged with age but remained legible. My headlamp moved across them one at a time. Air Force officers in 1950s dress uniforms, seated at this table. Across from them 3 entities, the same species as the things in the cylinders, tall and pale and composed, seated in the larger chairs with a posture that read as formal, diplomatic. One photograph showed a brigadier general extending his hand across the table toward an entity whose 7-fingered hand reached to meet it. Another showed both parties standing, a document spread on the table between them, pens visible. The third photograph was taken from a wider angle. In the foreground, officers and entities maintained their diplomatic arrangement. In the background, near the door I'd just come through, 4 men in civilian clothing were being escorted by military police. The civilians had leather restraints on their wrists. Their faces were turned partly towards the camera, and their expressions belonged to men who understood they were being handed over. One of them was looking directly at the nearest entity with an open, helpless terror the camera had frozen permanently into the photographic grain. I pulled my eyes from the photographs and went to the file cabinet against the far wall. Air Force seal on the lock plate, steel construction, 3 drawers. The lock broke on the second strike of the pry bar, and the top drawer slid open. Manila folders, classification stamps in red ink across every cover. I pulled the thickest folder and opened it on the table under my headlamp. The documents were old, typewritten pages, some carbon copies, yellowed and fragile at the edges. Classification headers marked every page. I skimmed, pulling key phrases from paragraphs of bureaucratic language as fast as my eyes could move. The entities in the stasis cylinders were designated as surrendered persons under the terms of a bilateral agreement dated 1953. They had been remanded to U.S. government custody by representatives of their own species, described in the treaty language as the delivering authority. The reason for their surrender was specified in clinical terms across 3 pages of text. These particular entities had been convicted of acts during a conflict among their kind, what the document called violations of governing conduct during a period of organized hostility, that their civilization's legal framework classified as capital, but would not execute. Their own species had decided these individuals were too dangerous to release and too protected by their laws to kill. Permanent containment in a foreign jurisdiction was the sentence. The U.S. government's compensation for serving as the prison was detailed in a technical appendix, stasis technology, the science that kept the cylinders running. The appendix also referenced ongoing cultural exchange as a secondary term of the agreement, and the photographs on the wall told me what that phrase meant in practice. Men in restraints, a handover. Human prisoners traded for alien technology, documented in formal language and filed in a cabinet underground. Another folder was newer, 1974, DOE letterhead instead of Air Force. The language had changed. Surrendered persons had become primary biological assets. Later addenda used colder terms, derivative holdings, viable issue, custodial reproduction controls. Whatever the original agreement had been, the prison had become a program. The room full of small tanks was inventory. A date in the final paragraph caught my attention. The agreement included a mandatory review clause. The delivering authority was to return every 25 years to inspect the containment facility and confirm the prisoners remained in stasis. The last recorded inspection was 1978. The next was overdue by decades. Either the delivering authority had lost interest, or they couldn't find the facility anymore, or whatever conflict had produced these prisoners had consumed the civilization that sentenced them. A heavy metallic crash sounded from somewhere above. A cylinder lid hitting the concrete floor of the main chamber. Then another vocalization, lower and longer than the first entity's clicking breath, rolled down through the stairwell and through the open panel in the corridor wall. A second entity was awake, and the first was still on this level, somewhere in the nursery corridor, separated from me by 50 feet of concrete and 1 broken wall panel. I killed the headlamp and left the treaty chamber through the back of the room, where a second passage, narrow and rough-hewn through bedrock, led deeper into the infrastructure below the silo. The passage ran 30 feet through unfinished stone before it connected with a utility corridor I hadn't seen from the main junction. The construction changed here. Poured concrete again, DOE era, with conduit runs and cable trays mounted along the ceiling. Infrastructure built after the treaty chamber, grafted onto the older excavation. The emergency lighting worked, 1 red flood every 20 feet, enough to move by. The corridor ended at a freight elevator. The car was large, 8 feet square, steel-walled, with a reinforced floor rated for heavy equipment. A separate battery bank sat in a recessed housing beside the shaft, its charge indicators showing partial power. The elevator had its own supply, independent from the silo's main feed. It still worked. The control panel was mounted at chest height on the interior wall. 2 buttons. One marked with an upward arrow, one with a symbol I didn't recognize. Beside the buttons was a biometric scanner. The scanning surface was recessed into a cradle designed for a hand to rest in, palm down, fingers spread. The cradle was the wrong shape. The finger grooves were too long, spaced too far apart, and there were 7 of them. The palm depression was narrower than a human hand and deeper through the center, curved for a skeletal architecture that didn't match anything in my body. The scanner was keyed to entity biology. The elevator required confirmation from one of the things in the cylinders before it would move. I stood in front of that panel for 10 seconds, holding the pry bar, doing the math. The elevator was my way out. The biometric reader was the lock. The key was 40 feet above me in a chamber full of opening cylinders, waking bodies, and at least 2 entities that had already reached consciousness. And the DOE sterilization team was somewhere on the access road above, getting closer with every minute I spent calculating odds. I went back through the utility corridor, through the treaty chamber passage, and to the broken wall panel. Listened. The nursery corridor was quiet. The first entity had moved on, or was standing still, or was somewhere I couldn't hear from there. I stepped through the panel into the main corridor, turned toward the stairwell, and started climbing. The cylinder chamber was worse. The fluid on the floor had deepened to 3 inches of warm, chemical-heavy liquid pooling from a dozen cracked seals. 5 cylinders were fully open, their lids displaced, their interiors empty. 3 bodies lay on the chamber floor in the fluid, limbs partially straightened, chests moving, eyes shut. Mid-thaw, unconscious but warming. 2 more had landed in positions closer to functional. 1 entity slumped against the base of its cylinder, with its head up and its 7-fingered hands flat on the floor, as if preparing to push itself upright. Another lay on its side with 1 arm bent beneath it and the other reaching forward, fingers gripping a cable tray on the wall. The 2 fully conscious entities were gone from the chamber. I could hear them. 1 was above me, somewhere near the sealed surface hatch, its footsteps a distant percussion in the access shaft. The other was below on the nursery level, its clicking respiration audible through the stairwell. I needed a body that was thawed enough to be movable, unconscious enough to be handled, and warm enough that its hand might register on the biometric scanner. The entity slumped against its cylinder base was too close to waking. Its fingers gripped the floor with visible intent, and as I watched, its head tracked slowly in my direction, following sound or vibration, or something else I couldn't identify. I gave it distance. On the far side of the chamber, a cylinder had cracked open along one seam, but hadn't fully released its occupant. The body inside had slumped forward against the gap, one arm and shoulder protruding through the split, the rest still cradled in the interior. Mid-thaw, eyes closed, limbs loose. The skin had warmed from the rigid cold white I'd seen on my first descent to something closer to living tissue. Grey-pale, with a fine vascular pattern visible beneath the surface, like veins carrying fluid that wasn't quite blood. I grabbed the protruding arm and pulled. The body resisted for a moment as the remaining seal held it, then released with a wet, sucking sound and slid through the gap onto the floor. The weight surprised me. 180, maybe 200 pounds, but distributed differently than a human body. Heavier through the torso, lighter in the limbs, with a center of gravity that shifted unpredictably as I repositioned my grip. The joints were the worst part. The knees bent in a direction my hands didn't expect, and every adjustment sent an elbow or wrist hinging at an angle that drove a spike of wrongness through my arms. The skeleton inside this body was organized around principles my muscles couldn't anticipate. I got the entity under the arms and dragged it toward the stairwell, leaving a trail through the fluid on the chamber floor. Its head lolled backward over my forearm. The face was inches from mine, clear under the red lights. Broad skull, shallow-set eyes behind closed lids, a mouth proportionally smaller than a human mouth and set lower on the face, closer to where the jaw hinged. The skin over the cheekbones was taut and smooth, and beneath it I saw the faint movement of something. A twitch, a muscular contraction, the first stirrings of voluntary motor function beneath a surface still returning to life. The file had called them surrendered persons. The incineration chamber had called men like me site contents. I didn't know whether I was rescuing a prisoner, releasing a war criminal, or using a living body as a piece of stolen equipment. I only knew the elevator wanted a hand, and I had one. I dragged it faster. The stairwell was the hardest part. 40 feet of narrow concrete spiral, descending with a body that sagged and caught on every turn. The entity's arm slipped from my grip twice, and I had to set it down on the steps to reposition. During the second stop, the hand I'd been holding flexed on its own. The 7 fingers spread wide, trembled, and closed again around my wrist. The grip was weak, barely any pressure, but the intention behind it was unmistakable. The hand was trying to hold on. I pried the fingers off and kept moving, down through the junction, through the main corridor, past the incineration chamber, through the broken wall panel, through the treaty chamber, where the photographs of smiling officers and restrained civilians watched from behind fogged glass, and into the utility corridor that led to the elevator. I dropped the body in front of the biometric panel and lifted its right hand into the scanning cradle. The fingers were warm and responsive to positioning. They settled into the grooves with a passive looseness, adjusting slightly as the scanner's surface made contact. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the scanning surface illuminated with a pale blue light, and the hand in the cradle twitched. The fingers pressed down into the grooves, a reflexive response to the scanner's activation, the way a knee jerks when struck. The panel beeped once. The display above the buttons changed from dark to active, showing a symbol I couldn't interpret, and a green status indicator. I pressed the up arrow. The elevator doors shut. The car lurched and began to rise. In the enclosed space, the entity's breathing changed. The shallow, arrhythmic pattern I'd been hearing since I pulled it from the cylinder deepened, steadied, and slowed into something regular. The body on the elevator floor shifted. An arm bent at the elbow, hinging in the direction the joint was designed for, and pressed a palm flat against the steel floor. The torso rotated. The head came up. Its eyes opened. The irises were deep amber, almost copper, with pupils stretched into horizontal ovals. They contracted in the elevator's emergency lighting, then expanded again as they adjusted. The eyes found me, fixed on me, tracked my position against the far wall of the elevator car with a focus that had nothing automatic about it. The entity was conscious, aware, assessing the man who had pulled it from its cylinder and dragged it through a prison built to hold it forever. The elevator kept rising. Neither of us moved. The doors opened onto daylight so bright it took my vision apart for 3 full seconds. I stumbled out of the elevator car into a concrete-floored outbuilding, single-story corrugated steel roof, rolling garage door on the far wall. The building I'd noted during my surface survey that morning and written off as a decommissioned utility shed. A steel-reinforced shed with its own elevator shaft running 200 feet into the earth. Afternoon sun came through gaps in the roof panels. The Montana Badlands stretched in every direction through the open garage door. Dry coulees, juniper scrub, the access road cutting south toward the county highway. My work truck was parked 60 yards away near the silo cap housing. Phil's sedan was gone. I made it 10 steps toward the garage door before the men reached me. 2 of them. Dark suits, federal credentials on lanyards, sidearms visible under their jackets. They'd been waiting near the outbuilding, leaning against a black SUV parked on the grass behind the structure, where I wouldn't have seen it from the main site. They moved fast and without surprise. They'd heard the elevator. "Stop where you are. hands where I can see them. The taller one had his credentials already extended. Department of Energy, Office of Secure Transportation. What is your name and what is your authorization for being on this site? Dale Metzger, Metzger Environmental Services. I have a DOE capping contract for this silo and I've been trapped underground for the past 2 hours. You need to listen to me. The shorter agent was looking past me. His face went through a rapid sequence of changes. Confusion, recognition, and something close to awe that collapsed immediately into operational focus. He stepped sideways, reaching for his radio. I turned. The entity was standing in the elevator doorway, upright, one hand on the doorframe, the other hanging loose at its side. The copper-amber eyes were open and adjusted to the daylight now, scanning the outbuilding, the SUV, the sky, the Badlands beyond the garage door. It was taller than I'd estimated in the silo, close to 7 feet, with a posture that became more controlled by the second. The disorientation of the Thor burned off in the open air like frost. It stood the way someone stands after a long confinement, testing balance, assessing space, cataloguing the dimensions of a freedom it hadn't expected. The shorter agent spoke into his radio. Quick, clipped, a string of code words I didn't recognize, followed by a grid coordinate. The taller agent drew his sidearm and aimed it at me. On your knees, hands behind your head. Do it now. I knelt in the concrete dust of the outbuilding with a federal pistol aimed at the center of my back and watched the entity in the elevator doorway. It hadn't moved. It was watching the agent with the radio, and on that broad, low-mouthed alien face was an expression I could only describe as recognition. It had seen men like these before. Officers, officials, the species that had agreed to serve as its jailers. The next 20 minutes happened in a sequence that told me the Department of Energy had planned for this possibility, even if they hadn't planned for me. 3 helicopters came in low from the east and landed on the flat ground beyond the perimeter fence. Tactical teams in unmarked gear deployed with equipment I'd never seen. Restraint systems built for a non-human frame. A transport capsule on a motorized dolly that was the right size and shape. Sedation apparatus with delivery mechanisms that bypassed standard human injection points. They approached the entity in the elevator doorway. The entity watched them come. It allowed itself to be sedated and loaded into the transport capsule with what looked, from where I knelt in the dirt, like cooperation, or exhaustion, or the resignation of a prisoner transferred too many times to resist the procedure. While the tactical teams handled the entity, a separate crew rigged the main silo shaft. I could see them working near the cap housing, mounting charges along the shaft collar, running detonation cable to a remote trigger stationed behind one of the helicopters. Thermite and shaped demolition charges. I knew the hardware. I'd used similar configurations on condemned mining structures. They were going to collapse the shaft and incinerate everything below it. The cylinders, the waking bodies, the nursery, the kill room, the treaty chamber, the archive, the photographs, the 40-year-old Chevy keys and the plain gold wedding ring. All of it, burned and buried under 1,000 tons of fused concrete and molten steel. The detonation was quiet from where I knelt, a deep, percussive thump that I felt through the ground before I heard it through the air. Heat moved through the soles of my boots. A sustained rumble followed as the shaft collapsed inward. A column of white smoke and superheated dust rose from the silo housing and drifted east across the Badlands. The cap housing sagged, then dropped 6 feet as the ground beneath it gave way. Within 2 minutes, the site looked like what the DOE paperwork had always claimed it was. A decommissioned hole in the earth, collapsed and closed, with nothing inside worth recovering. A man in a grey civilian suit appeared beside the SUV. He displayed the cultivated anonymity of a career functionary, his face unremarkable, his suit free of visible credentials, name, or insignia. He was maybe 50. He crouched beside me where I knelt in the dust with my hands behind my head and spoke in a tone that carried no emotion I could identify as personal. Metzger Environmental Services has been dissolved as of 1 hour ago. Your business accounts are frozen. Your home in Billings has been entered by federal agents under a national security warrant, and your personal records, devices, and files have been removed. Your vehicle—" He glanced at my work truck, still parked near the collapsed silo housing with the company name stenciled on the driver's door. "Will be processed as evidence and destroyed. Your cell phone, which was in the vehicle, has already been destroyed." I stared at him. "The closure contract that brought you here was generated through an inactive site records reconciliation. 4 offices saw a decommissioned missile facility. None of them saw this facility." He looked at the smoking ruin. "That error is being corrected." "Phil," I said, "your DOE liaison, Phil Cotter, has been intercepted and is being processed separately. He will confirm when asked by anyone that you died in an industrial accident at a decommissioned government facility. A death certificate will be filed in Yellowstone County. Your next of kin, if any, will be notified through standard channels. I have a brother in Bozeman. Your brother will be notified of your death. You will not contact him. You will not contact anyone from your previous life. You will receive a new legal identity, a social security number, a relocation package, and a federal pension. You will reside in a city chosen for you. Aaron would get a call. Maybe a folded flag if they were feeling theatrical. Maybe a box of whatever they decided had survived the accident. He would stand in his supply shop with a phone pressed to his ear and hear that his brother had finally let one more season kill him. The grey-suited man reached into his jacket and produced a single sheet of paper. A non-disclosure agreement with classification markings, heavier than anything I'd seen in Phil's redacted folder. At the bottom, a signature line waited beside a printed name that wasn't mine. "This is your name now. Sign it and you leave this site in a vehicle. Refuse and you become part of the site contents." His eyes moved to the smoking ruin of the silo shaft and back to me. "You've seen the room downstairs. You know what that means." I signed the paper on the ground with a pen he handed me. He took it back, folded it into his jacket, and nodded to the agents. They pulled me to my feet and put me in the back of the SUV. The vehicle pulled out through the perimeter gate and turned south on the county road. Through the tinted rear window, I watched the site shrink behind me. The collapsed shaft, the outbuilding, the helicopters, my work truck sitting in the grass with the company name facing the road. The thermos I'd filled that morning still visible on the dashboard through the windshield. A man named Dale Metzger had parked that truck 7 hours ago and walked to the silo cap housing with a pry bar, a rappelling harness, and a plan to pour concrete and collect a check and keep his business running another season. That man was a pile of paperwork in a federal shredder now. The convoy carrying the entity's transport capsule passed us heading east on the county road. 4 black vehicles and an unmarked cargo truck moved fast, kicking up a plume of Badlands dust that hung in the late afternoon light. They were heading deeper into Montana, toward the stretch of decommissioned missile country east of the Missouri River breaks. I watched them through the window until the road curved, the dust settled, and the convoy disappeared behind a ridge. 30 miles down the road from the site I'd just left, a road sign marked the turnoff for another decommissioned silo complex. I'd seen the listing in the original bid package when I submitted my proposal for the capping contract. 3 silos approved for closure, but the documents had referenced a network of 11 former launch facilities in the region. I'd only been contracted for 3. The other 8 were listed as status pending, no action required. The DOE placard on the turnoff fence was the same design as the one at my site. New posts, new razor wire, new motion sensors with clean housings and active lights. The same fresh infrastructure on a facility written off as dead for 40 years. The SUV kept driving south. The man in the grey suit sat in the passenger seat and made a phone call I couldn't hear through the partition glass. The Montana Badlands rolled past the tinted windows, empty, dry, ancient, full of holes in the earth that the government had dug during one war and filled with something else during another. I carried what I'd seen in the silo the way the ash outlines carried the shapes of the men who'd seen it before me. The difference was that I'd walked out. The cost of walking out was everything else. The name on the paper in the grey suit's jacket belonged to a man who had never set foot in a missile silo, never pulled a body from a stasis cylinder, never seen a photograph of American officers shaking hands with the things they'd agreed to bury in the Montana dirt. That man had a clean history, an empty past, a federal pension, and a city he'd never chosen waiting for him somewhere east of here. He was all I had left.